Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you hear me well. Those in the hall and those online, welcome. As we reconvene, we turn now to what I believe is one of the many highlights of these 2 days, a conversation with someone who stands very close to the creative heart of the work that has brought us all together for these 2 days. Aleksi Barrìère is a French-Finnish director, dramaturg, and writer whose work moves fluidly between music theater and literature. He's the artistic director of the performance collective La Chambre aux Échos, where he develops interdisciplinary music theater projects that seek new forms for contemporary stories. Many of you will know him above all as the co-librettist who collaborated closely with Kaya Sariaho on Innocence. That collaboration places him at the center of the creative process behind the opera we are discussing throughout this conference. Joining him in conversation is Hentschker, director of the Martin E. Siegel Theater Center here at the CUNY Graduate Center. Through his work as curator, producer, and scholar, Frank has made the Siegel Theater a vital meeting place for international theater and performance. Together they will reflect on the making of Innocence, Barrìère's collaboration with Sariaho, and the possibilities of contemporary opera today. Please join me in welcoming Aleksi Barrìère and Frank Hentschker.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Tina, for that truly wonderful introduction. And thanks to the Barrìère Book Center for, I think, hosting this very important conference about contemporary opera. We all don't talk enough about it. We often complain that there's not enough done, not new work, experimental work, and very often, because of short runs, sometimes, of course, it is overlooked. So I'm too honored to meet you, Aleksi. We just met now. And yes, we at the Siegel Center Bridge Academia and Professional Theater, International and American Theater, and we are interested in contemporary art. Julia Rebentisch, a philosopher in Germany of aesthetics, she says, you know, what is really contemporary art, which she calls after postmodernism? How do we tell stories? How are they meaningful after the modern, the postmodern? How do we create work that touches us, work that influences us and makes us think differently, and perhaps also anticipates the future and helps us to get a bit more comfortable with it? And this opera, I think, is one of the examples. So first of all, thank you, Aleksi, for joining us and for coming. Did you fly in, or how did you, for the conference? You live in Paris, right?
Yes, but I was here for the final rehearsals of the opera, which had its premiere yesterday at the Met.
Yeah, we saw it early on Friday morning. It's very impressive, I think. I think a brilliant stage design, fantastic, I think, great music, I think, an outstanding cast. And there's an old saying, at least in the theater world, maybe not the opera world, we say, you know, no one goes to the opera because of the stories, you know, because, you know, they are often almost children's-like tales or fun stories, you know, unbelievable. And in the realm of Broadway musicals, Fish Tank, Snowball themes, this is the exact opposite. It is about, as you all know, of course, about a school shooting. So you have been involved from the very, very beginning. So how did the idea start to focus on school shooting as a theme for contemporary opera? If I understand right, and you mentioned in your notes, there has never, ever been an attempt to dramatize in an operatic form.
I don't know. I think we didn't start. I mean, two things I think are true. We didn't start with the idea of making an opera about a school shooting, and we also didn't start with the idea of making a contemporary opera, if we're talking about the categories that we are using now to describe the work. I think the question of how to find an honest way to tell stories is a more maybe it's not a ahistorical, but a more praxis-oriented way of answering the question, how to tell stories, that you were asking, because there's been a crisis of storytelling, of course, but I think this is a cyclical one in the history of the arts, of how stories get old, and the forms we use to tell stories get old, and we need to renew them, because much like words fall out of fashion, stories are tools to describe our reality, and our reality, to some extent, of course, is shifting. So what is interesting is that in this case, we didn't start with the story. It was Kaija Saariaho received an invitation from the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, London, to write a new opera, and her first intuition to write an opera that sounded like our world was to write what she called a fresco, and a multilingual fresco at that. So thinking as a composer, she thought that she wanted to capture the sound, what she perceived was the sound of our world. And this sound, she felt, is multilingual, complex, layered, sometimes noisy, but behind the noise and beyond the noise, there is something, there are complex realities. I mean, noise is also a word in information theory, right? It's about how do you single out behind a wealth of information, the relevant information. And what happens is that we have to look for these patterns, try to look for these converging stories. So Kaija had this idea that to be able to have a multitude of characters in an interesting way in a story, you have to explore something very specific, which is how different characters react to the same event, and how they process differently the same event, and how different perspectives on the same event can exist. So when Kaija's way of approaching this theme was to start with this musical intuition and to call in a dramaturgical team, a libretto team, which was, so this was in the end of 2012. She invited Sophie Oksinen and myself to dinner, which is how all great projects and not so great projects start.
2012 or 2020?
12.
12.
Yes. Yeah, it's been a while. We were younger and more hopeful back then. And we started discussing this, and we was what was interesting, was this intuition of Kaija's that she wanted to have two people working on the libretto. She wanted the storytelling of the novelist, Sophie Oksinen, and she wanted, because Sophie hadn't worked back then, hadn't worked on an opera project yet, wanted my insights on the form, on the libretto form, and on the possibilities of opera, and from a dramaturgical point of view and a formal point of view. So this team started brainstorming based on these formal ideas of how do we capture that feeling that she had of what the world feels like and sounds like, and tell a story of that. And very gradually, step by step, we came to the idea that we have to talk about something that can be told only in a choral form that she was aspiring to. And what better than this fine leveling emergence of responsibility between the collective and the individual than forms of violence that exist in a social context that are being prompted by a social context. So in that sense, it was not, to be clear, it was not about the fact that there had been no opera about a school shooting, so hey, we should be the first to do an opera about school shooting, which would be exploitative and not so interesting also. I think it's more about the fact that maybe the opera is actually the best formal model to talk about what a school shooting is in its causes as the eruption of a co-produced violence within a group, the polyphony of the production of violence, and the polyphony of the process of how a group recovers, a group being made out of individuals. So I think when it comes to handling, like to having 13 people on the stage that each have a voice and that still form a variety of textures together, that's a type of storytelling that can be achieved only with the combined tools that make up what we call opera.
Yeah, I mean, I looked it up here in America. In 2025, we had 233 school shootings, plus additional ones in K-12, plus a handful in universities. The most famous one in Minneapolis was, I think, 29 dead. Of course, it is a serious subject. The opera stands out that it does not show the violence, that it is not Quentin Tarantino style in the movies, who says, wants us to show how horrible violence is, but we all are mesmerized. They are cool people, and I'm very, so I don't like, to be honest, I don't like the movies because of that. So this is an attempt to go to the causes and consequences. Tell us a bit about the idea behind the storytelling.
Well, I mean, definitely the idea of not showing the violence was something that was there from the beginning. A very conscious decision by Sophie Kaya and myself, because we know these, when you look at the stories of shooters, of course they love war movies, they love watching the depictions of violence. There's no way of showing violence that will not to some people be a pleasant aestheticization of it. You need to stylize it. You need to decide what amount of violence is actually useful, like storytelling-wise, in order to convey what you're talking about. I mean, I think you can really have both rationally and emotionally create a very strong narrative about violence without actually romanticizing violence or carrying it out further, because of course for people who have been subjected to violence, seeing depictions of it is in itself a violence they receive. So I think we have to be very careful about that. And likewise, I think what you're pointing at is that we chose not to feature the shooter as part of this story, although in this staging he does appear briefly. But our original intent was that the shooter is entirely absent from the stage, and that he also is given no name inside the narrative. And because it's the fascination for the monster always will trump what requires a more delicate kind of listening and care. So you really have to eliminate that cumbersome object from there. So to give the full attention to the survivors and also to the victims who have not survived, to actually talk about these experiences, which, as you see, like in the remarkable physical work that has been done by the choreographer Akko Rentz on the characters of the survivors, it's a form. It has been about finding a physical language that talks about the subtle realities of a recovering body and mind. And this is something extremely delicate and difficult, and you don't have the space, you don't have the time, you don't have the possibility to explore those things if you're just being constantly pumped up with adrenaline and cortisol, images of violence, and the story of this monster and your fascination for the monster. You need to get all these things out of the way to be able to focus on the other things which are valuable, important.
Yeah, why I think it's a very interesting attempt, and I think also successful stories. You also wrote about it, about the idea of the Trauerspiel, the Greek tragedy, where we have the catharsis, which functions perhaps, as Aristotle said, as an immunization. You see it, then it won't happen to you, or a cleansing, that your bad thoughts are washed away, you won't do it. Or you experience the rage, the murderous ideas, which all are in us so deeply that you don't have to do it in real life, actually. But the question is, do you really have to show it? And I think the idea of this opera, to take the step back, not have the shooter, but look for causes, look for consequences, the 10 years later, which is an interesting idea, the 10 years, a decade, to look back of the story. And I liked that hint when I researched a bit, and also articles you sent me of the no theater. Interestingly enough, you and I think the librettist, Sophia perhaps, looked at the Japanese theater, no theater, which has an idea that living and the dead coexist, that they are there, which are the old, the no stories, and that it's about healing. The idea of telling the story is also to heal, but in a different way. So how was this story, which also has very narrative form, and we can listen to some of the words here, how was that influenced by no?
Well, what's the easiest way to tell about this? I think, like, for instance, this is something we discussed already this morning, like in relationship to stage forms in opera versus oratorio in Caesario's music. So I think this is something she was always interested in, finding alternatives, because if you're talking about like storytelling, opera traditionally has been one of the forms where we have spectacularized violence and certain types of emotions, which by default also means excluding certain other types of emotions from the realm of what you show on stage. And oratorio, passion plays have been one alternative, and I think in the history of theater and of music, people have been looking at no theater for a long time, and like Artaud has, Beckett has, and have also been very interested in no theater. And in 2013, I worked with puppeteer Claude Jamin, who had studied no in an actual no school, and we did this production of Gustav Mahler's Kindertotenlieder, which are based on poems by Friedrich Rückert about the death of his own children, actual death. And Rückert was an Orientalist, a big translator of poetry from Middle East and Far East. And we had this idea that there's something that's in Rückert and Mahler, which famously is going in that direction, geographically and culturally, in a way that we wouldn't nowadays consider uninformed, but for its time was really far-reaching. And so we did this version where we performed the Kindertotenlieder twice. The first time it was sort of a realistic story of 5 stages in the grief of a mother this was just after Sandy Hook. It was a mother who had lost her children in a school shooting. And the second time we performed it, she was going through therapy, and this no dancer was representing her inner process of grief. And it was, so this is when I made that connection and started working on school shootings, and then it made its way into this project of Innocence from there. But for me, it was always associated with that, with the idea that in no theater we have the paradigm of a kind of theater that is not about the act of violence, but about how that once an act of violence has been committed, you are dealing with it forever and ever until you're actually processed it properly.
I liked what you wrote. You said your work was to help develop the form, I guess the opera form, with the knowledge of the dramaturgical possibilities of music theater. So it's an idea to develop something, to make it different, and this idea to have that kind of no theater where the living and the dead are next to each other in some kind of equilibrium, where almost in an angelic presence, it's no longer so much also about who's wrong, who is right, but say what happened, and it's a view a bit from afar. Before we come to the language, I also liked your idea, and you called it calibrating, calibrating the, here you called it, you will talk about it, but you said this is kind of a calibrated attempt to tell a story. Tell us a little bit about your idea. The sugar, you said, that in
what context did I say that?
Well, you did say that industrially, isolated sugar is in its raw form.
yeah.
And that often
Right.
what we see, what attracts people, is kind of raw, isolated, which you do not see in context anymore, which is in a way the traditional dramatic form.
Yeah.
And this is a step away in the storytelling in a beautiful way. I think it's so.
Yeah, I think this wasn't my big rant about catharsis, and this idea that we are, with the industrialization of our entertainment forms, now we have learned to produce, we know how to produce art forms or forms of entertainment that push exactly the right buttons in the same way that we know how to chemically isolate sugar and put it in everything we eat. I mean, there's this idea that our limbic system, our hormones are being played like a piano by the forms, and we are self-medicating all the time instead of going for specific contents or specific artworks. We know that we need a 2-hour blockbuster to wind down, or we need a romantic comedy to get that's 90 minutes precisely, and people are self-medicating, and it all comes from basically the same idea that of how we think of catharsis, or how video games are branding themselves as cathartic. It has actually become entered the mainstream, and which is all simplification of what Aristotle wrote some centuries ago. I find this all based on the same idea that we are using music or films or series or everything we watch as a way to self-medicate emotionally. And I think we need to give space for forms that are creating a space for self-actualization instead of medicating and using pure components. Like in the examples I just gave.
Yeah, and I think you did say that, which is true. What does really change? We watch a great film, or we watch the opera where we know, do we change our lives? Do we really reflect? Do those stories still work? And if we look at the political landscape right now, it doesn't seem to work. There has to be something different. I think the idea to imagine a dramaturgy for an opera, to say this is, as you said, the best way actually to deal with such a catastrophe, which the unspeakable, actually, what there happened in a personal life, but also to a society. That's why that story is so interesting, because it's the most personal, to lose your daughter in a school or son, and then, what does it mean for a society? So this incredible tension of a personal narrative versus a collective narrative. How do you tell it? How do you approach it? And in respect and with dignity to victims and to families, and I don't know, maybe families who are watching us right now around the country. We are also part of HowlRound, which we have a live stream service where people look at stories. So are we reflected, and how are we reflected? Does it contribute to pain, or does it offer something? And I think the idea that opera perhaps is a way out of that, an exit of what is not possible. Let's maybe go to, I don't know where we are time-wise. I'm so interested in the idea of the languages. If I understand right, Sophia wrote it in Finnish. Only 4% of what remained of the text is Finnish. There are 8 languages on stage. Tell us a little bit about that idea.
9 with the Finnish. Yeah. Well, like as I said, the multilingualism was there from the beginning. It was a musical prompt from Kaya for the very basic musical reason that for her this is what the world sounds like. And of course, like multilingualism has existed in literature and in music before, but I think it has. It's often when you encounter it, like if you've seen this film by Iñárritu, that's multilingual. Of course, it's called Babel. And most of the time, if you find works that are multilingual, you'll see that there is some kind of association, direct or indirect, with the myth of Babel.
You wrote you don't like that idea. Why?
Yeah, I don't want to blame people for having that association, but well, first of all, at least you need to acknowledge that in a biblical context, there are these two sides to multilingualism, like multilingualism as a symbol of fragmentation, as in the Tower of Babel, and the myth of the Epiphany, which is a more harmonious form of multilingualism. So I think, like for any signifier, as we discussed also earlier today about consonance and dissonance, like we must be careful in assigning only one type of meaning to one effect or one pole of an axis. I think multilingualism is something that can be a powerful symbol of isolation and disconnection between people, but it can also be a powerful symbol of diversity and of chorality and of the richness that makes up the world, and of the richness of what makes us very different. And what's interesting about the fact that we are experiencing things very differently, including grief and love and fear and all these things. So there's no, multilingualism is not purely a negative symbol, a symbol of cacophony, of the noise of the world in Innocence, as in, I mean, I tend to work a lot with multilingualism in many of my projects, and I think it has, until now, I'd never had the feeling that I repeated myself, because I think these are always, there's so many ways in which you can use it. It's just like any form of, any formal solution. It can mean so many different things, and I wouldn't like to perpetuate the idea, the tragic reading of multilingualism as something that we are condemned to because we built a tower that was too big. I think it's much more layered and ambivalent than that. So we use, in Innocence, we use multilingualism also like in a very versatile way, I think, that it's used to show the background of the family that is celebrating a wedding. It's serving as a way to connect or isolate the characters. It's showcasing the students all together experiencing the same trauma, but being completely isolated from each other while experiencing it. So it's something that's dissociating and something that's connecting. And that's, I think, also what it does. And it gives the opportunity for something, one of the most beautiful things, which is translation, which is also something that happens, not only in the process of making this piece, but that happens inside the piece also sometimes. The process of saying that there's something very deeply mysterious and beautiful in translation in general, right? That you're supposedly saying the same thing, but there's no sound, no word that remains from the original, and something is being passed from one reality to another and disintegrated in the process. I think that's one of the great mysteries of the human mind, and to have that process constantly activated, and that is at the heart of the misunderstandings and ultimately the connections we create between people. It's linguistically strong, but it's also a very apt metaphor for everything that we do, every communication that we have.
Yeah, and from our theater side, I really would like to congratulate you and Kaya and everyone for the choices. We do live in a multilingual world. If you go out to the streets of New York, what do you hear? We white people, if I may say so, we're actually in the minority. The majority of the people in New York City, is a diverse population. 60 to 70%, I think, in the Bronx is Spanish-speaking. If you want to go and see a play in Spanish tonight in some theater, it will be very hard. None of the big theaters have Spanish translations. They don't care about it. It's shocking. We feel that the existence of parallel languages on stage reinforce a kind of a global, or one could even say planetary consciousness, which we actually need. All the problems we face, whether it's school shooting, economy, the hate for women or LGBTQ, they're global problems. They're not individual problems by countries or by politicians or this. And I think to reflect a world, and it's called the international school also, I like that as an idea, to have these languages there where, also people can find themselves. It's so highly, highly unusual to hear they coexist next to each other. And the reference you made, I think, to Renaissance madrigals, where you say there is no pressure of immediate understanding, which I also like, that, you know in a way what this is about, but you don't have to understand right away. And there is a translation help. The great Edouard Glissant, who was a brilliant thinker, who actually was a professor here at theater, who wrote a lot about the creolization of language and said, it is not a loss of unity and the fall from paradise that we don't have one language. He said it's actually the opposite. It enriches us. We take from languages, we borrow them, we put them new together, and the creolization is actually a celebration of the real world. And we are no longer supposed to really think in these kind of borders of nation states and this. This story you tell is highly local, but also it is a global story. So I really think also to give praise to the director, Simon Stone, the way it is choreographed and the way it is directed, this kind of dreamlike mechanic, what we see, the turning of the house, which one could say is the little Tower of Babel, if I want to go there, where all the languages exist next to each other in these kind of tragic, but also in the beauty of tragedy in a way. One shouldn't say, even if Aristotle said it, that the terror and pity, to enjoy it as a review it, and someone said that's why theater is so terrible. Why do we look at misery of other people and pay money to see it? But I think there are very good reasons, and you give the reasons. Have you guys ever talked to families, or did someone come to opera, your operas? And I think you have done it in a couple of countries. Maybe say where and what were reactions?
Well, yeah, I've done a lot of audience talks, and starting from the premiere in Aix-en-Provence in 2021, I've met people who had encountered, who were survivors or were families of survivors, friends of survivors.
Did you know that up front they would come, or they just came to you after?
No, I mean, unfortunately, in Aix-en-Provence, at the premiere, it wasn't advertised what this was about. So a lot of people were taken by surprise, and which was not the best way to create discussions, I think. But of course, there was this whole aspect of people getting the experience that is quite rare at the opera of discovering the story on the spot, because usually you know everything about the storyline before you experience it. So we wanted to experiment with that. I think for people, I mean, especially with a production that includes a lot of very triggering images, it's a little tough. And I mean, of course, collectively, we've gone through a lot since we first started talking about making a piece that involved these topics. I mean, myself, I've known people who were at the Bataclan and who had these experiences of a shooting. This was a shooting that happened in November 2015 in Paris, in a concert hall and in the neighboring bars. There were just, for a lot of people, these images became very intimate, intimately triggering images, because more and more people have had, let's say, images, traumas that normally appear only in war-torn regions have become more common. And I've met people in Paris, in Amsterdam, in all sorts of places. Here, I guess now it has become sadly accepted that people who live in this country have increasingly warlike memories from their childhoods and youth. But I mean, when I'm thinking of it, it wasn't something we accepted so readily when we first started working on this project. It's crazy to see how this has evolved now. So yes, people have been talking about their experiences. how it mirrored their own
Was
experiences.
it healing? Did they feel it was healing?
I don't know, and I certainly don't make any claim to heal anyone through art. I think it's what's.
Why not? You said it's about a healing. You're right about it.
I don't think I mean, this is the same thing as with the catharsis. I don't think we can go around and promising like some magic drugs that will help people, snake oil in artistic format. I think what we're not offering solutions. We're not going to purge your sad humors, and we're not going to give you joy. What we can do is create a space in which emotions can be experienced, not by pushing your buttons, but by creating a space where you can experience and reconstruct your own emotions in a way that feels safe, and where you can actually give your like surrender to the things that you want to feel, or that the things that you see on stage make you feel. I think that's a very different thing. Although it sounds like a subtle nuance, it's very different than watching a film that you know will make you laugh, or a film that you know will make you cry by pushing exactly the right buttons. I think this is a very different artistic goal. So in that sense, I hope that people who have had traumatic experiences involving gun violence are able to see this performance and safely explore the things that they have, that they feel when they hear about this. We see depictions of it, but certainly we cannot make any promises that there is any solution to individual feelings. I think individual feelings are precisely that, individual. They're highly personal, and the process of grief is an extremely solitary and extremely personal one. People have to find their own way, and that the arts are giving tools, creating spaces for safe emotions that we don't have. I mean, there's just too much at stake. Of course, your workplace and your relationships all have all sorts of stakes, personal stakes, material stakes. But we need safe places where we can actually feel things without feeling existentially threatened. And we are so pumped up with contents that are pushing our hormones in one direction and another, and anxiety that is putting us in this constant state of tunnel vision, where we just need artistic experiences that offer something different than that.
Yeah, I think it really, really does. And I also would like to add, it does matter what is shown in public spaces. It matters what is shown on stages. It matters what is shown in galleries. And it matters what themes are handled by opera. And I think to focus on something like this and to put it out there in a context which normally one would think they're not natural allies, I think it's a great service to also seeing stories represented that are stories that are part of our life. How many of you have seen the opera? Have you put the hand up? So we don't know, maybe we don't need to show an excerpt of it. Let's maybe look at the libretto, which I think is a very beautiful work. It's very pure. It's very clean. You know, just to read it, a student in the beginning, it says, "I can't go to work. I can't board a plane. I can't be in places where my phone has to be switched off. I can't go to my classes. I can't go to the theater or the movies. I can't sit with my back to the door." Traditionally, often, you know, one has kind of a more aria or dialogue. So this is a different narrative structure. I would like to tell me a little more about, since you worked so close with the librettist and you were part of the project from the beginning, the kind of narrative structure of it. And that seemed to be naturalistic, that seemed to be, in a way, a reflection on reality, but then also it's not. Tell us a little bit.
Well, I certainly never thought of it as naturalistic, and it's when people have been describing the opera in those terms, I think they have been mostly influenced by what this production looks like. Because to me, I mean, of course, there would be a fine nuance between naturalism and realism. I mean,
What's the difference?
well, naturalism in a sense of a photorealistic depiction of life at scale 1. And realism, is, I think, is more about what parameters you choose to in your reproduction of reality. I mean, director Peter Sellers had this great statement that when you look at the second act of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, so actually a couple going through a fight actually takes 1 hour, and that in that sense, Tristan and Isolde is a great work of realism. Think it's really about what you're paying attention to. If you're listening to a work that has many layers where things overlap, when one thought doesn't follow logically the other necessarily, it can be called a stylized form, but I think it can also be called a very realistic form, because this is how the human mind functions. So we have had difficulties showing these things in music or in text until the 20th century, often because of conventional limitations, but actually since forever we have been using, for instance, the strategy of narration of dreams or dream scenes in plays and operas to try to access different types of logic that are not this linear narrational logic that we use in a lot of media. So I think this is something that we have always tried to tap into. And in this case, I think the structure of the libretto is in a way extremely psychological, if not psychoanalytical. It's a very classic idea that you have reality, this element of life that tries to move on, and through your narrative of your life, that is this arrow that only moves forward and that has only one direction, all the rest that you're keeping out of that narrative continually bleeds in, because you cannot keep it all out, because your past is always going to bleed back in from this clean narrative that you're creating of your life, which is a narrative, precisely. It's already a stylization. If you say that, if you read the bio of anyone or my bio from the program, you're going to read a narrative that's curated and cleansed from everything that's inconvenient or that doesn't make sense. But of course, no life is linear. And I think when you have this libretto that shows a story about about a wedding, and people are trying to move forward with their lives, but are completely blinding themselves to things that they refuse to process or even to talk about. And you have these students who come in and who are repeating these things, or are describing their PTSD and describing what it feels like to live in their bodies that are still trying to process this violence. And then I think you actually have a pretty realistic narrative of what it feels like to be alive in denial.
Yeah. Well, I think that it was interesting, here go my notes, interesting that kind of realistic narrative, and then these kind of aria-like, or the Marita especially, then her songs that go straying from the libretto into, I think, some Finnish, almost indigenous, multi-vocal spheres, which I thought was incredibly beautiful, also very refreshing. I've never seen anything like that on a stage. I think you walked a very thin line, but somehow, it did work out. You also have what we call, which in Germany we would say, starker Tabak, like strong tobacco. The waitress, the mother says to the father, "He killed my daughter with your gun. It could have been as well your own finger that pulled the trigger and killed my Marketa." How did you deal with the idea of guilt? We witnessed this, perhaps audience, we also somehow complicit in it. in the Greek idea that we share these perhaps violent fantasies, but we don't do it. But the idea of guilt, and what did you discover? What did you wrestle with for the libretto?
I think this is something that is very well known of all survivors. And you read the texts of Holocaust survivors, they all talk about the same feeling of guilt. And guilt as a feeling is something that's a very prominent part psychologically of survival. But I think that element, that's the ambiguity of the title, Innocence, right? That the feeling of guilt, as opposed to the feeling of innocence, is an individual psychological feature. But then there is a completely separate issue of who is actually guilty of anything.
Like video games come up, or social media, or other things. Where do you place some kind of?
Well, clearly there are things that, I mean, we are going through a lot of different factors. I think we need to have a very nuanced portrayal of what are all the factors that come in. Just pointing at one of these factors or pointing at is tantamount to pointing just at the shooter and saying the shooter did it. And our media or our gun laws have nothing to do with it. It will also be absurd.
You find out the brother is implicit, the father is.
Spoilers. Yeah. I think there's a fine nuance that needs to be done. That is, I think of this famous sentence by the Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who ended his life here in New York, who said, only a few are guilty, but everyone is responsible. I think that is a good indication of the separation of these realms, that we need to, of course, we need the justice that's able to determine guilt, and that's a very specific category of what society does, is to judge people for their, who are guilty, but that doesn't exonerate us. Having a culprit doesn't exonerate us from, as a society, thinking about responsibility in a broader way. And of course, it wouldn't even make sense to bring everyone behind bars for their parcel of responsibility in something that required the cooperation of an entire social climate to explode in violence. But of course, you cannot just blame the person who pulled the trigger. There's a lot of people who are together in that motion that leads to someone pulling the trigger. But I think this distinction between guilt and responsibility is very important, and it's the one that was made also, coming back to the previous example, that was made by Hannah Arendt after the Holocaust. The notion that we need to examine our agency on a personal level and determine our part of responsibility is required for us to be able to examine things as a society as well.
Yeah, and I think since this is an unusual way how you tell the story, with multilingual, the two parallel streams of the reality and then the 10 years, this very little line, Jan Kot was a great Polish theater writer, thinker. He said theater, and I guess also opera, is a thin line between the living and the dead. You know, we see dead people on stage, but they are represented by someone who is alive. But it's not him, he is somebody else. Dead people come back. So many of what we see, is from the past, but they exist, and they're with us, as many indigenous cultures, and perhaps for good reasons, claim they are actually with us. They're never gone. Nothing leaves the universe, the planet Earth, the orbit. Everything that ever happened in some way is here. And before think we have some time for questions, if it's 1 hour, to go to the epilogue, which I find curious. The idea, you call it, it's scene 15, the future. Before it happened, I didn't know what I would be when I grew up. Afterwards, I knew I would become a doctor. Another says, my daughter started ice skating and I had to go to the shows where she performed. When I sat in the audience for the first time, only afterwards I did notice that I had been more focused on her performance than on being seated with my back to the exit. I move to another country and I will start over. I believe I am able to do it. And the very last words are, tomorrow at 6 o'clock again, you will drive to the conservatory, but Mom, don't buy me these apples anymore. Mom, next year don't buy me a birthday present. Mom, let me go. So the very beginning was, I cannot work, and now Mom, let me go. Tell me about this idea of that very short epilogue. How did you come to it? Why did you do it?
Well, of course, if you look at the first scene, you have a lot of students describing how they are trying to deal with their trauma. And in this last scene, you have just a few of them who are describing a more hopeful future. So statistically, maybe in tone, it's a very optimistic epilogue, but the overall picture doesn't really get much lighter. I think it's just trying to be honest and realistic again about the process of healing, and that it takes different amounts of time for different people, and that now we have people who are, some of these people are starting to be able to move forward with their lives. But out of the 13 characters, one of whom is dead already, it is these 3 people who are starting to feel better and this mother who is starting to understand that she needs to let go of the memory of her daughter. That's just really an inkling, because we needed to open the door at the end. We don't know when this is happening. This is years from the events, and we need to open that door because we need to also say that is part of the story, that it takes a lot of time, and everyone does it at their own pace. But of course it happens, but we can't lie and have a happy ending. And what Kai Sarao does musically is that we have something that is where all the elements are slowly resolving into a harmony that could reach a resolution, but doesn't reach, musically speaking, a resolution. Instead, it dissolves, and we are just left outside of the time of the work, of the timeline of the work, and we're back in the present, and suddenly we're the ones that have to deal with how this opera has made us feel.
And I think we spoke of calibration earlier. I think it was very well calibrated, ending very subtle, a very thin line, very fragile, vulnerable, but also, yes, with some green of it, or some plants coming through the snow in a spring after a brutal winter. We have a couple of minutes, and I think we have such a brilliant audience, and I most probably have to admit that everybody in here will know so much more about music and opera than me. So I think since we have Aleksi here, do you have some questions? Do we have 10 minutes, right? So I can run the mic, and maybe you shortly introduce yourself and say who you are. And Aleksi, are you still ready to answer?
Of course. I mean, hopefully I can also listen.
It doesn't have to be a question. It can also be a remark or something that is on your mind.
That would be well earned if you have been here earlier today.
Anybody? Yeah. 1 second.
So you said there, everyone knows more about. Yes, Tommy Flanagan from the Finlandia Foundation National. You said everyone here knows more about opera except you. Well, I know less. I work for a cultural foundation that does Finnish and Finnish American culture in the United States, and obviously we have a very big interest in Saariaho and her legacy, and everywhere you can witness that. So this may be a very uninformed question to this audience, but I'm always looking for: is there anything Finnish in your mind about this? Does someone need to know something about Finland in any way to sort of understand Innocence or the creation of it? And the answer can certainly be no, but always have to ask that question. Thank you.
We've reached the finish line. Well, I mean, this is we're 3 Finnish people that came together to make this work. And I thought it was an interesting thing that Sophie said. We started working, she said, which is not necessarily something that we think about like that way, like in the music world or in the theater world, but as a novelist, she said, I write stories about realities that I know. So this has to be set in Finland. And so that's how it became sort of a key element also to the operas have been set in Finland before. I've even read that Finnish operas set in Finland and sung in Finnish have been performed at the Met before in 1983 when the Finnish National Opera came on tour and performed operas by Kokkonen and Sallinen. So this is not the first time you see an opera with Finnish being sung in it, set in Finland on the stage of the Met, which is already a curiosity in itself. It's just continuing a great tradition. I mean, of course, any Finnish story usually features people who are drunk, domestic violence, and now gun violence as well. It's keeping up with the evolution of Finnish society, which happiest people on earth, right? But I guess that is there's a wonderful history of literature and storytelling in Finland that I think is the reason why there are great storytellers still nowadays coming from Finland and whose novels and plays and movies are being translated all over the world. There's a belief in the necessity of telling stories, which I think is universal, but it has had some remarkable forms in the Finnish context. But of course, what the artist does, I think, is to talk about the things they know, to try to reach a little bit beyond their reality. So we certainly were not trying to make something that would, let's say, represent Finnish culture abroad. I think if you look at the movies by Aki Kaurismäki, you know that Finnish people are maybe not the best at branding their own country as a place of peacefulness and beauty. But I think what we're trying to do here is to go through that experience of living in that society, which has its contradictions and its issues. But among other things, it's a society that's been trying to deal with increasingly varying forms of living together, that has been trying to exist as a society and as a democratic experiment since 1905, since before its independence already, when its parliament was first created. And it's a society that is multilingual. It's a society that is full of contradictions, but also full of resourcefulness. And I think it's an excellent setting for a story about people from different backgrounds who are trying to understand each other and trying to deal with solitude, because it is also a very lonely society where that has high drug use numbers and high suicide rates. And I think if, again, I can only encourage you to go visit Finland, find out for yourself. It's a beautiful country and culture.
Are there more questions? Or here? So introduce yourself.
Grażyna Drabik, and my question is as an audience member. I saw it yesterday. Well, the thing which struck me most, besides of a lot of what you said, I kind of share your perspective, was the word brave. How brave this opera is. Exactly, because it confronts our schematic way of thinking. I don't see any problem with Finnishness of it. I see it really has a parabolic element. It's a beautiful example of something specific, rooted in locally specific, but it absolutely speaks universal truth. I can imagine a version of it done for the Connecticut shot, for any of the shooting, with the different realities, but how do you win the audience? How do you win the people willing to put themselves to this kind of confrontation and sharing in the space? I was with 3 people, all very much knowing what we have up, and they were really confused.
They're confused?
Well, they were kind of reluctant to give in to the opera. They wanted more of the epic.
Yeah. So what efforts, in a way to engage the audience?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, it's tricky to get people through that door in the first place. The Metropolitan Opera doesn't have the reputation of being like the every man's entertainment. So I think it's what I've seen, like with this opera being performed in different countries, in different contexts. I've seen that they've been observing a surge in younger audience members visiting the opera specifically to see this piece, which I find very encouraging. I hope it will be the same here. Of course, there are all sorts of factors that are making it harder for people to gain access to these places, but they're increasingly more open ticket policies. We were trying to create these discussions, these opportunities for audiences to encounter these stories and what we are trying to do. But as far as what I have observed, I think this is not a piece that caters to traditional opera patrons best. It is a piece that is trying to reach out to people who have perhaps a different type of media literacy, different expectations from live performance. And I'm not sure what we can do beyond that, beyond talking about it and subjecting people, of course, voluntarily to as large a range as possible of aesthetic experiences, so that the range of what we expect and the stories we are able to listen to and to discuss becomes broader. And I really don't know that there is an overnight solution to this, apart from, I genuinely think that the more different types of music you listen to, the more different types of stories you hear and tell yourself, and the deeper your exploration of human reality is, and the more open you will be to discussing the stories of other people and hearing what their stories are about. And then we might actually start looking for solutions. But maybe that is my light at the end of the tunnel, or my epilogue.
Maybe one last question, or observation, or a note. Where? Oh, here. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. My name is Draza. I am a fan of opera. I'm really interested in what you're saying and the bravery of this opera, just to build on what you're saying and how you began the talk by saying it is telling a story from different perspectives, from 13 different perspectives. And I think that is a brave way to stage an opera. And I'm wondering, I think that the new generation of opera appreciators will relate to that, only because we are growing up in a world where there is no center, and there's a total democratization of even just the voices. And so I wonder if you could just say anything about how we should be watching this opera that is different. Enjoying this opera that is different than than a traditional opera. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm going to go see it, and I find that to be such an interesting thing. That if you can say something about how to enjoy this opera that speaks to that from telling a story from different perspectives that is somehow different than going to see a traditional opera. And thank you.
I mean, yeah, define traditional opera. It's it's really three kids in a trench coat kind of art form. I don't know what all these works from the Monteverdi onward have in common in the end, like as a genre or as a style or as a storytelling form. But I think, of course, there are precedents in the history of opera where I'm not saying that this is something that will completely subvert all your expectations. You'll have characters on stage, and you will follow these characters and maybe find some of them likable, and until you don't find them so likable anymore, or find yourself rooting more for someone that you had no sympathy for in the beginning. In that sense, I feel like it's a fairly traditional form of storytelling. But what's peculiar, maybe not so peculiar anymore in the age of The Wire and The Sopranos, is that you have a larger range of characters on the stage, and that the way you review each one of them informs how you see the group dynamics, and that the fact that the group dynamics are a character of its own, I think, is something that we've been trying to explore in this piece that is less usual, maybe in opera. That think something we've been trying to do in all our collaborations with Kaya Sarriaho also is just to subvert the expectation of the protagonist, because the protagonist as, you know, the mirror to the self. I need this guy who's probably going to be this person of a certain age, origin, and gender, who is going to be the stand-in for humanity, and that this person is going to have this hero's journey and all that stuff, which is about perpetuating a very closed-minded vision of what it means to have a self, to be a person, which is something much more fluid and complex and layered and fragmented than what protagonists usually are. So I think this whole idea of things being mirrored, fragmented, layered is something that Kaya Sarriaho's music allowed us to do in this piece, and that we talked of in terms of chorality, fragmentation and chorality, and this double motion. And if you listen to her music in pieces that are not at all theater pieces, you'll feel that often things start from noise and come into very fragile states, and then they disappear again. It's a statement as to what it is to exist in this reality, and I would hope that the opera stage, or whatever we decide to call a combination of music and theater on the stage, is going to help us overcome our need for big me's, for big heroes, for big narratives, for the big guy with the big idea, and the billionaire who's the working man's hero, or whatever these figures are that we are mass producing and that create monsters. I think like this type of music is giving us a key as theater makers as well to challenge this idea, the royalty of the self that is creating all these problems that we're dealing with nowadays. Think Innocence is a proposal in that direction.
Wonderful. So, Tina, you're going to close, but first maybe a big applause for Aleksi and for his work and for sharing.